Thanks so much. Okay, so I'm going to draw from some previous publications and some more recent ones. A lot of the maps and charts that I want to show you are here from the Atlas of Global Christianity. So this will be something, I happen to carry one with me wherever I go, even though it's very heavy, so I have a copy with me if you want to take a look. And more recent publications, one which was mentioned is The World's Religions and Figures, which is out there, which deals a little bit more on the methodology side, but has results in it as well. And then even more on the methodology side is our new yearbook, our annual yearbook. Brian Grimm is here, of course, and he and I and two others edit this annual yearbook on religious demography, a real page-turner, you know, with all the latest on fertility rates in Nigeria and stuff like that. But it buttresses much of what we're doing in our study. And in case you're wondering, the first question that's asked in a presentation like this is, where do all these numbers come from? And these two books, of course, deal with that. But the short answer is censuses, surveys, religious communities, and informants, or people in these various places who help us to figure out what the situation is on the ground. And it's not straightforward at all, which was what makes it interesting. So anyway, that's a quick mention of where this comes from. Now let's put Asian religion in its global context. And to do that, I'll show you a couple of maps here of the world. If you could, see this a little bit more clearly, you'd realize that blue is Christian, green is Islam, and brown is tribal religionists, and pink is Hinduism, and you have Chinese folk religions. We'll be zooming in on Asia in just a minute. This is a situation in 1910 by country. If we fast forward to 2010 by province, of which there are about 3,000 in the world, we see quite a change over that period. And we want to focus a little bit on what's happened in Asia. But before we get there, let's look at the global picture. Here's the makeup of the world in those 2 years. And there's two, if you studied this, you'd see there's two major shifts here. One is the disappearance, relative disappearance of Chinese folk religion, and that has to be, of course, related to our subject today of religion in Asia. The other is the rise of percentage of Muslims from 12.6 to 22.4, which also has an Asian component to it. So those are two things, those are the two biggest changes over that 100-year period. The other thing to mention is the percent of the world that was religious in both of these dates. And in 1910, it was over 99%. You'll say Uruguay on the bottom there. You'll have to think about that a little bit. Why is it there? But it is something to look into. But over 99% of the world's population was affiliated with a religion. That has changed quite a bit by 2010. It is now about 88 or less, depending on which measures you're using. There's more than one way to do this. But what's missing from that is really my first point. A more sophisticated chart here shows that actually, though the world is less religious in 2010 than it was in 1910, it's actually more religious in 2010 than it was in 1970. And the reason for this is the collapse of communism, really. And what's going on in China right now, as you'll hear from other people who are experts on this, it seems to move things in that direction. So when people talk about a resurgence of religion, it isn't so much related to 1910 as it is to 1970. Every day the world is becoming more religious right now than it was the day before, which would be counterintuitive to people in the West stepping out onto the street. And it's been counterintuitive actually for the last 50 years or so, and many people have gotten it wrong because all they did was step out onto the street where they live and didn't actually pay much attention to what was going on in the rest of the world. And one of the most profound effects of this is actually in the composition of the world's atheists. If we look at 1910 and 2010, You see, 90% of all the atheists in 1910 were Europeans. That's the blue there. But actually, 85% or so of all atheists in the world today, or in 2010, a few years ago, are actually Asians, and most of them are East Asians, and most of the East Asians are Chinese. So you have a sense, and that, of course, doesn't look like the bestseller list, you know, of the four horsemen of the atheist apocalypse, or whatever you want to call them. Those guys, you know, have a lot of interesting ideas, certainly don't represent atheism in a demographic sense. We'll have to see what comes of that here in the future. Now, if we zoom in a little bit into Asia, over half of all Asians were Chinese folk religionists or Buddhists, and there are ways in which all these categories overlap. This is a map of Asia by majority religion, and Chinese folk religion is the big color, or the color there in China in 1910. If you fast forward to 2010, Chinese folk religions eclipsed by atheism and agnosticism, largely because of the rise of communism. And again, that's 1910 to 2010, but since 1970, or even a little bit later in this case, things seem to be moving back in the other direction. What we did to try to summarize this is produce two rectangles that show the relative weight of each religion. Each little square here is 1% of the population of the region. And here you can see that beautiful color that represents Chinese folk religion shrinking quite a bit. And you see a new color, or a relatively new color of tan there, that's pulling in agnostics. Atheists are in here as well. You can see there's been a pretty big change in Asia as a whole. And this will get more accentuated as we get closer to China here. You might not see it here, but if you look at the statistics behind this, you'd see that Muslims have actually increased considerably as well, from about 16.5% to 26% during that period of the population of Asia. Chinese folk religionists and Buddhists together down to 22% from over half of all of Asia. Asia, by the way, defined by the United Nations, is Western Asia, which goes all the way to Israel, and then East Asia, Southeast Asia, South Central Asia. It's big, okay, so it includes all of that. It might be helpful for us to zoom in a little bit. So let's look at just Eastern Asia, which is these particular countries on this map. Here you have Chinese folk religionists and Buddhists, about 89% of all people in this region back in 1910. And that drops, this is a very different looking map, that drops to about 45% by 2010. Agnostics and atheists together, using, again, this analysis, are about 35%. And if we look at the bars, or the rectangles here, you can really see quite a transformation. You also see Christians showing up on this. They're the blue here, from 0.2% back in 1910 all the way to about 9% for the region, which includes Korea and some other places, as you can see here. And we can unpack this more if you want to look at the exact statistics which are in the book. But this just to give you an idea. We also are thinking about Southeast Asia here today somewhat. And you can see here, this is 1910. Orange is Buddhists, and brown there would be tribal religionists and new religionists, who are actually together in the majority in Indonesia in 1910. We go 100 years later, we see quite a different picture. Christianity, Islam on the rise here. And then if we look at our little rectangles here, we see Muslims have grown considerably in this period. This is all of Southeast Asia, which has a fairly large Buddhist contingent here. You see the decline of tribal religionists and new religionists, and really it's Islam Buddhism, and Christianity that have the lion's share by the year 2010. Okay, so that's just a quick overview of some of the changes in the area. Then let's talk about religious diversity for a minute. I think Brian Grimm is going to talk about later. I'm just going to cover how it fits on the global side here. There's two different kinds of religious diversity. One is interreligious, and the other is intra-religious. We're talking about inter, in other words, Buddhism, Islam, Christianity, that kind. And there's different ways to measure this. We did this in the Atlas. If you say how many religions are there in a country that are over 0.5%, then the most religiously diverse country is Canada today, with Canada and Suriname, and then Indonesia, Panama, Guyana. And this is measuring 18 different kinds of religion, including 2 that are non-religious, which I've mentioned, atheists and agnostics. If you're a little bit stricter and you say how many religions are out there over 5%, then you're right in the middle of Asia there, with Vietnam, China, South Korea, Malaysia, Taiwan, and Brunei all having 5 or 6. And then if you say how many religions are over 10%, then there's just these 4 countries: South Korea, Vietnam, North Korea, and Singapore. Now, a more sophisticated means of doing this using a market share that's developed from economists comes up with this scale. And this is, again, using 18 different religious categories. And again, you see a strong Asian presence here: South Korea, China, Singapore, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Vietnam, all the way on the top here, with very high scores for religious diversity. So that's really my second point, is that if you want to go to a religiously diverse place, go to Asia, particularly go to Singapore or China or South Korea, and then you'll find a situation where people are living with very diverse religious communities all around them. I've lived on Singapore on a couple of occasions, and that is certainly the case. It's very different living there than it is here. There's a lot of religions here, but we have a huge Christian market share in the United States, which changes things dramatically. So, and then, of course, we could talk about religious diversity in China, quite a complicated diversity, which now includes atheists and agnostics, but all different kinds of religions. I think somebody else will talk about that later. Now, I want to finish with one final illustration related to Christianity, because what's happening in Asia actually is affecting Christianity today as well. This is the subject that I study over at Gordon-Conwell, the composition of Christianity around the world. And you can see from this chart that this is a thrilling area of study, that Christianity has basically been about 1/3 of the world's population. I was in Geneva recently, and I was giving a presentation, and someone said, we can't trust your stuff at all. I said, well, why not? And he said, well, all you're doing is flogging Christianity all the time. Your statistics are showing fantastic growth of Christianity. I said, you haven't seen our stuff. And in fact, in David Barrett's work, who was my predecessor, the World Christian Encyclopedia, the single most quoted fact from his work over all these years is that 7,000 Christians are leaving the churches every week. That's the major thing that came out of his work. So we're probably not so good at flogging Christianity if we're trying. Okay, but as you know, perhaps, there have been some profound changes in Christianity, even though it's been about 1/3 of the world's population. And the biggest one is the shift from north to south, which I'll just talk about for a minute. Here we have Europe and North America, about 80% of all Christians in 1910. And if you keep an eye on that, Europe, 66% there for a second. Here's what happens over 100 years. Shrinking 25%, and even with North America, it can't even reach 40%. That's a profound shift. That's what the southern shift of Christianity to the south, which comes up today as we think about religion in Asia. And there's an exhibition that was done in Berlin. A Chinese designer moved to Berlin, and one of the things that she noticed was the profound difference between German culture and Chinese culture, okay? So she said, I'm going to do something about this. I'm going to do a series of icons showing this difference. And here, I want to show you a few of them and bring up a couple of points here. So blue is German and red is Chinese, all right? So on punctuality, Germans, right on time. Chinese, a little bit more leeway in this area. How about handling of problems? The Germans just walk right through it. Chinese, maybe give a little bit of space, walk around it. The queue when waiting, the Germans line up neatly, the Chinese all bunched at the window. Remember, this is a Chinese person living in Berlin, okay, that's doing this. How about opinion? Similar to problems, the Germans very direct, Chinese not so direct. Contacts, the Germans with just a few contacts and the Chinese with a great web of relationships. Now, I said about 3 minutes ago, I said Christianity has shifted from the north to the south. It's shifted from Germany to China, you might want to say. And so wouldn't it be interesting to think about the nature of Christianity in relation to this shift, the cultural shift? And one of the things I noticed, I'm 1/4 German and the rest Scandinavian, but I noticed that in many ways, Christian faith seems to be more compatible with the icons on the right than on the left, especially when you get here and especially when you get to this icon. The way of life, an individual, whereas we have a group on the right. This is really a profound contrast. And many people have noticed this. Many people have noticed, what they've noticed is that much of the training and the theological training and other types of training that people get in the global south, even in China, comes from the north, comes from the Germans. What a shame it would be if you have a demographic shift, but you still have all the way of thinking in the old way, in the northern way. There's nothing wrong with the northern way of thinking, but it isn't the only way to think in relation to Christianity. A friend of mine wrote a book about this, which is called Mangoes or Bananas, The Quest for an Authentic Asian Theology. And he laments the fact that Christianity in the South is like a banana. It's yellow on the outside, but it's white on the inside. All of that training is German, you might say. Wouldn't it be beautiful for Christianity to be more like a mango, which would be yellow on the outside and yellow on the inside? And that's part of what he's trying to say there. Now, there's a demographic reality to this, and that is that for the first 900 years, the majority of Christians in the world were actually Asians and Africans. But if you take a church history course anywhere, including where I work, most of it is talking about Europe, what's happening in Europe. So both in the historical sense and in the present sense, as we said, we're in a shift from north to south. There's a real reason to pay attention to what's going on in Asia from the Christian perspective, all right? There's definitely a reason. If you're an agnostic or atheist, there's a reason. If you're a religionist, you're involved in a resurgence that is based largely there. And if you're a Christian, you should be paying attention to what's happening in Asia, because this is where the future lies, especially in theological perspective and that sort of a thing. And it's been quite, I won't say much about this. This is an attempt to show the numerical strength of Christianity in Eastern Asia over its entire history, and it's gone up and down through the centuries, starting with the arrival of the Church of the East in 635. So for Asians, this is a pretty interesting time to be alive in relation to both non-religion and Christianity. That's what I'm trying to say. So here's the four things that I'm, if I can get to them. Okay, here's the four things that I can summarize. Asia has the vast majority of atheists and agnostics, but what you see around you is not represented by that. There's a global resurgence, which is also based in Asia, which most people here don't realize is happening. Asia is the most religiously diverse continent, so that's also the place where you get that. But a lot of books written about religious diversity are written in a non-religiously diverse context. That's something to think about. I always go to Singapore if I want to figure out how to operate in religious diversity. That's where you're going to find it. And Christianity, after all these centuries, is returning to Asia. That's one way to think about it. 60% of the human population lives in Asia, but only 15% of all Christians are in Asia. 70% of all Muslims are in Asia. 85% of all atheists are there. So we can see that there's a rebalancing that might be taking place during our day, and that's something to think about as we go forward throughout the day. Thank you very much.